our webinar series volunteers, Joanna Foley, Bianca Cobb, and Joni McMasters, who helped bring this series together. Our past series guests have been Professor Ernest Hooker of North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina. Professor Hooker opened up the series on March 15th, and then we had Jose Vasquez of Monument Lab out of Philadelphia, who spoke on March 22nd. And then back on April 5th, we were fortunate to have the descendants of Black Revolutionary War patriot Ishmael Titus and his descendants, Sage Chioma, Solomon Titus Taylor, and Deidre Lavelle joined us from New York and Greensboro. And for tonight, and as always, as far as housekeeping, we'll utilize the Q&A or the chat feature for comments and questions, and we'll do our best to field questions at the end. Want to ensure that we get our presentations in for each participant. Mr. Freeman, who joins us from Western North Carolina Historical Association in Asheville, and Mr. Rees, who's joining us from his home state in Pennsylvania. At least I'm assuming he's at home. But thank you to both our gentlemen, Mr. Freeman. And how about we'll start with you, and to learn more about our fine gentlemen, allow me to briefly talk about them. Trevor Freeman is out of Western North Carolina. He's a native, and he's an alumnus of Appalachian State University and East Carolina University, where he holds an MA in American History. He has worked or interned in several parks and battlefield sites, including the Cowpens National Battlefield, and is now the Public Programs Director for the Western North Carolina Historical Association based in Asheville. His research interests include the American Revolution, as well as Western North Carolina and environmental history. He has published an article in the 1780 skirmish at Cane Creek, preceding the Battle of Kings Mountain, and his 2020 master's thesis, which focused on the service and lives of North Carolina's 480 plus identified African-American or Black soldiers in the American Revolution. He's an avid hiker. I called him a cyclist, and he said, no parts of that. A hiker is what I meant to say earlier. A paddler and a fly fisher, so he's in the right part of the country, and you will often find him exploring or leading outings in the places he writes about. And tonight he is joining us. And following Mr. Freeman will be author John Rees. John is a writer and historian based in Pennsylvania, who again makes it a point to illustrate the day-to-day life of soldiers and how they experienced the war along with their families. And Mr. Rees even delves deep into this experience by participating in period reenactments and marches. I even heard where you braved the cold of either Pennsylvania or New Jersey, and you were in full period gear, including period footwear, and you almost suffered or did suffer some frostbite. You're a brave man. In Mr. Rees's book, They Were Good Soldiers, African-Americans Serving in the Continental Army, 1775 to 1783, it's the role of African-Americans, most free, but some enslaved in the regiments of the Continental Army, is not well known. Neither is the fact that the relatively large numbers served in Southern regiments, and that the greatest number served alongside their white comrades in integrated units. And so, John, it's good to have you with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you later on. But in the interest of time, I'd like to turn it over to our good friend out of the western part of the state, Mr. Trevor Freeman. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm normally hosting Zoom programs, so it's odd to be on the other side of the screen, so to speak. So I'll go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint. And we're sharing here. Everybody can see my screen okay?
I can see it. We can see it.
Okay. Well, you'll have to forgive me. The image I'm using here, it's obviously of a African-American Continental soldier. Very few depictions as far as illustrations of them to begin with, much less militia soldiers, which is kind of what I'm focusing on tonight. Hopefully it segues well into John's presentation on Continental African-American soldiers. So I'll give you kind of a condensed version of a chapter of my thesis and talk a little bit about Guilford Courthouse, obviously being the local major battle, as well as some of the implications for, the later lives of militia veterans, hopefully in about 30 minutes. So first off, I have to give credit where it's due. I think it was John Hope Franklin who mentioned standing on the shoulders of giants, and it certainly feels like I'm relying heavily on the contributions of scholars who have come before, including Franklin himself. I also have to give a large thanks to revwarapps.org .org, which has fully transcribed pension applications that are also text searchable. And without that ability, without all the hard work there, it would be incredibly hard to do this. Even have to thank John, whose book was, I think, the last secondary source I used. It came out right before my thesis, so have to credit all the historians that made this possible. So to give you a little bit of an overview of what I looked at, I found, and I was wrong in my description to you, an estimated 468 Black or African American soldiers who served North Carolina specifically, or were from North Carolina and somehow found their way into other states' forces. Most of these men served in North Carolina, like I said, but a few served in neighboring states. I'll talk a little bit about some specific examples. Performing a variety of roles, I found that their motivations were incredibly varied also, but there were both patriotic, civic motivations, as well as economic and very localized motivations. Overall, I found that these African American soldiers in North Carolina were critical to the war effort, but achieved really mixed results in their personal lives and what their service in the war brought to them. But overall, I argue in my thesis that specifically as veterans, they achieved a more respected status as a result of their service and as a result of that post-war veteran status. Of course, their gains were very tenuous and certainly not applicable to all people of color, but it's important to understand how this group fit in with this early period in North Carolina to understanding a lot of different elements of history. So to give you a look at my map, and I'm sorry if you can't see all of that, but this map shows the residences, pre-war residences of all the known African-American soldiers in North Carolina. I think my number here, 368 out of 468, so not entirely representative. And this also lumps, it doesn't differentiate between militia and continental soldiers. You can see this heavy concentration along the northern border with Virginia, especially in some of these counties like Halifax and Granville County. I found that often the soldiers that I'm specifically speaking about were mixed race individuals with African, Native American, and white ancestries. Most were poor, single, young, and already free. In fact, I think it was only 9 that I identified that were enslaved at some point in their lives. Nearly 61% of these known 368 were from that poor, remote border region with Virginia. And I also found pretty interesting, a few had already served in the regulator conflict on the side of Governor Trion's forces, at least, and also a few in the French and Indian War as well. Also found at least 35 had been bound out or apprenticed at some point before or possibly when they enlisted. And as John Hope Franklin demonstrated, they already had a very tenuous status as free people of color before their enlistment. And so hopefully we'll get into what that status looked like after the war, after their service. I think it's best to probably start out with looking at the laws that govern the militia. And if you're not familiar, the militia is essentially this peacekeeping force. It's almost akin to either a police force or the National Guard and various elements. But it's well over 100 years old by the time of the American Revolution. All the colonies have these militia forces, and there are specific laws governing registration for being drafted into the militia. And some of these laws in different colonies restricted Black service, and they also changed then in accordance with enslaved insurrections or rebellions. So in Virginia, the restrictions began to tighten on Black service in the 1630s, and then really became hardline after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. when a large number actually of his rebels were African Americans. South Carolina then effectively barred Black militia enlistment after the Stono Rebellion in 1739. And these laws continued throughout the Revolution. Still a few people managed to find their way into service, but nowhere near to the degree as North Carolina. And then a little further to the south, Georgia, this new colony, which is becoming more and more heavily an enslaving colony on the eve of the Revolution. They voted in 1772 to arm enslaved people if necessary to defend the colony if war came. But Georgia had even fewer African American soldiers. And then North Carolina stands as kind of a more lenient system, maybe. Their laws were more permissive in allowing African Americans to serve. And I'll argue that that's reflective a little bit of the status of free people of color in North Carolina compared to their northern and their southern neighbors. Actually, since 1746, North Carolina had mandated that both free people and servants, to quote the period verbiage there, of age between 16 and 60, they were required to enlist for possible militia drafts. And though a few enslaved men, I think only one in the militia system, and also some who were indentured or were who bound out, a few of them were drafted into or served as militia substitutes. The overwhelming majority were free men. There's also an interesting caveat: the 1756 law, which ended compensation for wounded militia veterans in North Carolina. So serving in the militia then became a little bit of a calculated risk if you volunteered for that. So getting into motivations, and I'm very interested to watch the program with the descendants of Ishmael Titus. Fascinated by his story. But, in his specific case, maybe could chalk up the motivation to freedom. He substituted for his enslaver in exchange for the promise of freedom. That's a strong enlistment motivation. But then there are other things also for the free men who enlist. So enlistment and land bounties, as well as a small nominal daily pay for militia soldiers. One example, Cesar Chavez got about $150 as a sign-on bonus for his stint in the Bertie County militia. Volunteers, if you registered voluntarily to take a militia term, they appeared to get larger bounties than substitutes and drafts. So that's a little bit of an incentive there. And then with the draftees and substitutes, if you were called out, you were drafted to serve in the militia, you could pay a fee to get out of it, £10, or you could also pay for someone to substitute for you. And in many cases, we'll see with North Carolina's Black militiamen, we'll see people who enlisted multiple times, sometimes as volunteers, then as draftees, as substitutes, in all manner of enlistment. Also found it interesting that a lot of them expressed very local and civic motivations. Mark Murray is a really good example. He gets pressured into enlisting first and foremost as his father tells him essentially, it's his duty. The British are in the low country of South Carolina. It's his duty to turn out, defend his country. And then later on, he enlists as a volunteer in a militia company, along with a group of neighbors who encourage him to enlist. They say, join with us, we'll all be in a mess company together and go out on this short tour of duty. And then there's also a really explicit mention in a lot of pension applications about the threat of Tories and all the ravages of David Fanning and all these other Tory leaders, and how essentially that threat that they posed wasn't just confined to white citizens. It's also very much a reality for the free African-American citizens of North Carolina. So these three brothers, John, Thomas, and Wilbur Gibson, all very explicitly mention, all these crimes and deeds that David Fanning is doing in the eastern part of the state, and how they're joining and pursuing him. And then also in the western part of the state, you see these concerns over Native Americans. So David and Hardin Denham, who are actually, I believe, from Guilford, no, they are from Granville County, I believe. And they end up serving on tours against the Cherokee in the western part of the state. Also a little interesting, and maybe something that still a little bit of a mystery, but cross-state militia service. You'll see a lot of pension applications where the applicant lived in North Carolina, but a few people enlisted in Virginia regiments, a few enlisted in South Carolina militia regiments. And as we see later on, some even enlisted in Maryland companies of Continental regiments. So there's a little bit of a interesting question as to what was their motivation to enlist in these different units. Give you this example. Something that you may be wondering is, well, with the draft system, did this single out or maybe target free people of color? And at least in this example, William Bryan, he's actually a witness for a African-American militiaman, Holiday Hethcock. And he testifies that he's frequently mustered in companies with free African-Americans, believes that they were equally liable to draft and equally liable to volunteer into public service. Again, it's one example, but it's a pretty explicit statement that speaks to that question. And then if you can see this, go into Thomas Gibson. So I told you the Gibson brothers' motivations were related to Tories and Loyalists. And Gibson explicitly mentions, as you can see here, the depredations and the burnings, murders of Fanning, and how they pursued Fanning's companies and fell into several skirmishes with them. You also see that with his brother Wilbur, who again mentions Fanning and the burnings and all the fear in the countryside at that time, that probably not only white residents but also people of color felt with these Tories roaming about. So take a look specifically at what the roles of militia were and what African-American militia soldiers would have done during their time in service. So the majority of the 468 African-Americans identified, they served in the Continental Army at some point in time, at least the majority did. Many there served in both forces, both the militia and the Continentals at various points. And there's, this interesting period in 1778 when, due to manpower shortages in the Continental Army, the local committees of safety are drafting recruits from the militia and putting them into the Continental line. And so this is a point in time when you see a lot of that crossover. A lot of people who have already served in the militia then become Continentals. There's a huge problem in researching Black soldiers, or really any soldiers in the militia, and that there's substantially less documentation, less troop rosters, and less real documentation of the battles they fought, the command structure, etc. But what I can tell you for sure is that the presence of African Americans in the militia was both widespread and also crucial to the efforts of North Carolina's militia and all kinds of different endeavors. Typically in the militia system, the enlistment was shorter, so typically 3 months. Some ranged as low as a 10-day stint, and then some ranged upwards of 9 months. So it varied considerably, but still much shorter than Continental service generally. With this, they had a little bit more autonomy and agency. and how that affected African American soldiers in particular is something I'm interested in and something I try to address in the thesis. And there's also an interesting seasonal nature of enlistment into the militia. So it revolves around crops. The vast majority of the soldiers being farmers, subsistence farmers. You'll see a lot of militia veterans who say, pulled my crops up and harvested, and that's the time I volunteered or served in the militia. You can also imagine, the hardship that brings if you're drafted during the middle of planting or growing season. Your family's depending on that, and you're then enlisted into armed service. Overall, I'll say that there's probably lesser of a physical toll exacted on militia soldiers compared to Continentals, but they still bore that risk. Remember, with that 1756 law, if they're injured, they don't receive that type of compensation. And interestingly, they're also not inoculated like Continental soldiers were at various points against smallpox. There's also less of a time, in these short terms to develop real camaraderie, but for all militia soldiers, they likely knew the neighbors that they were serving alongside. And so for African Americans in service, how this affected their standing and any camaraderie, any benefit in the post-war period, it may have just strengthened or augmented in some way the local connections or familiarity they already had with people they were serving alongside. So I found a pretty interesting range among the Black veterans, the militia, as far as what their service looked like. Some served upwards of 6 or more militia tours. Again, it could be any reason, as a volunteer, as a draftee, or a substitute. I think one man even served 9 tours. That was the most documented militia veteran I found. And they served from the beginning of the war until the end. Richard Roberts, North Carolinian, an African American, he serves in the 1775 Battle of Great Bridge in Virginia. And then Samuel Bell, he's serving in the Low Country of South Carolina in 1782, and remembered hearing the bells from the city as the British are withdrawing. They fought in many small skirmishes, also some of the larger ones like Briar Creek, Rockfish Creek, Callan's Ford, and on these Cherokee expeditions, performing a wide variety of roles and actions. John and Thomas Gibson owned horses, so they served in a mounted unit. William Brown was sent on missions to destroy ferries in the eastern part of the state. And then various soldiers served as servants for officers, cooks, construction of barracks and other laboring duties, as well as guarding prisoners in Halifax as a jail guard. And interestingly, in the pension, I think maybe even more so than and John might have something to say about this, but the connections, fostered between militia soldiers and their commanders, specifically with Black veterans, I found a really high degree of connection and, some fond memories even with individual commanders that various times for either being in battle or they're testifying on their behalf later on. But I think that the camaraderie that developed there in the militia system is something that can't be overlooked. So getting to, as we're talking about Greensboro history, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, this is probably not, I wouldn't say most infamous, but the maybe least fondly remembered day for the North Carolina militia. And again, the Continental Army in the South is basically wiped out, captured at Charleston in 1780. not really reformed in heavy numbers until later in 1781. And so the North Carolinians fighting at Guilford Courthouse in March were lumped into, militia units. But many of the African-American soldiers, as well as the white soldiers, had some form of either previous militia service or Continental service even. Here at Guilford, there were roughly 1,000 militia, NC militia in the front line, and they received a lot of flack. They broke early in the battle into some form of disarray, and Nathaniel Greene blamed them for the performance that day. And so, as punishment, many of those present were subjected to a 12-month Continental draft. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a second. So Edward Going, he enlisted, and he remembered serving at Guilford Courthouse. He described it as, remembering Colonel Holland Arthur Williams, and he remembered that the company that he was in was confused and scattered. They broke and regrouped again near the Rocky River. Francis Coley, when he joined, he again talks about being in the battle and the troops rallying. So a suggestion of his unit breaking as well. And then John Toney, he's an interesting character for sure. Looking at genealogical records for him, he appears to be a man of Native American and African American ancestry. And this little excerpt here is from his pension application, actually from somebody testifying on his behalf, that he remembered John being in the battle at Guilford Courthouse, running home, and then being taken and made to serve until the end of the war. So again, one of those draftees that gets punished for the behavior at Guilford Courthouse. And then Makaja Hicks, who is a North Carolinian and African American, who ends up serving in a Maryland regiment of Continentals, and he remembers Guilford Courthouse as well. He had a pretty interesting experience, as you can see, being captured at Charleston, serving on a prison ship, at some point escaping, as he claimed, and making his way back into the Maryland Regiment. So just a few examples, relating to African Americans at Guilford Courthouse, what we actually know about some of the individuals. And then one of the things I really hone in on in my thesis is the post-war lives of North Carolina's African American soldiers. Many continued residing in or nearby their home counties. This is, let's say, the number that continue residing basically in the same place is significantly higher than white soldiers. Judith Van Buskirk has found that I think something like 67% of white veterans end up, moving about to different places, including into the expanding, Western territories and then states. Whereas North Carolina's Black veterans typically are, staying basically where they were born, where they were raised, or where they were residing at the time of their service. Around 1/3 of North Carolina's Black veterans applied for federal pensions, or at least their survivors did. State and federal land bounties in Tennessee, these were offered after the war, and many veterans of different races, different ethnicities, end up selling their either land grants, or they sell their pay certificates for just pennies on the dollar. But I think this happened maybe a little more often to North Carolina's Black veterans after the war, as they typically end up residing in the same location. And so they don't really necessarily receive the same economic or upward mobility opportunities that some of the other veterans do. But as I mentioned earlier, I argue that their time in service may have fostered camaraderie with fellow soldiers that benefited in some ways. Specifically, if they lived long enough to file a pension application, But I think some of the language in the pensions also suggests that they enjoyed maybe a little bit more esteem in their immediate communities because of this service. One example for William Taburn, he's mentioned in actually several other pension applications by white veterans as one of their brother soldiers. He served with them. And then Edward Going, one of North Carolina's Black veterans, recalled his messmates. He recalled the people he served with, was in close proximity in the militia with, and apparently had some kind of fond memories there. And then I talk about the impact on race relations and how this class of Black veterans, free people who had served and enjoyed some form of esteem as a veteran, how that impacted race relations as North Carolina became ever more hardline, more restrictive, and as free people of color enjoyed less and less legal standing, and became closer to enslaved people in the legal rights and representations they had. I look at how where did this fit in with North Carolina's Black veterans? I'll give you a few examples here from Mark Murray's pension application. Again, so this is somebody I talked about earlier who volunteered for service in the militia for these kind of patriotic and civic reasons. And you can see the testimony from neighbors. He actually lived in Tennessee later on, and you see this language from people who are testifying on his behalf, how he and his wife were very respectable for colored people. And it's this denigration, this putting down of African Americans, but this uplifting, this example of esteem of one individual and his family. And I argue, that's because of his service, his status as a veteran. And then again, just another name down here at the bottom, testifying about, though he was a free man of color, he was highly respected, trusted, etc. Again, that same example of what I argue is the real importance of the veteran status and the esteem. And then I found this interesting, this rejection rate of soldiers who are applying for later pension applications. Again, I didn't explain this earlier, but there were two acts. The 1818 Act applied to Continental veterans who had served, I believe, 2 years in consecutive service. And then finally, in 1832, Congress passes an act allowing militia veterans and Continental soldiers who had served for lesser times to apply for a federal pension application. Of course, by this time, 1832, many of North Carolina's Black soldiers had already died. And this is also the period of time, it's 3 years before North Carolina passes its revised 1835 Constitution, which significantly changes the rights of free people of color in the state. And I'm looking here just at pension applications that mention an applicant's color or racial background as an African American, and you see this higher rejection rate for the 1832 veterans. Now, there's a couple of possible explanations. One being that it's that long after service, there are less veterans who can testify to their conduct, testify to their service that are alive by this point. But it's also interesting to note how much North Carolina's kind of racial boundaries and racial laws are tightening at this point. Maybe that's also factoring into this higher rejection rate. So to conclude, with specifically North Carolina's Black militia veterans, there's this wide array of motivations, experiences, but also a lesser degree of monetary rewards, maybe even than their Continental counterparts. I found an unknown number of those that were actually killed or wounded in service. A few of their pensions mention minor wounds, but with the lack of documentation, it's hard to know exactly how many Black soldiers in the militia died during their time in service. I did find at least 14 who possibly served at Guilford Courthouse, again, either in the militia or in the case of Makaja Hicks in a Maryland regiment. And then with their tenuous gains in standing, esteem, it's debatable whether that's more or less true for militia soldiers. But either way, by 1812, the next major conflict, North Carolina passes a law to bar Black militia service except as musicians. So again, it's this lost chance for mobility or for doing something essential like serving your community, serving the country. And many, of course, did not even live to see pensions or any kind of final payment for their service. So there's hopefully we'll have room for questions at the end, and if you have any, I'm glad to take those. But I'll stop my share and turn this over to John.
Thank you, Trevor. And I was sitting here trying to think of a question I could ask as John Rees was getting his PowerPoint presentation ready, just to fill the time. But you answered all of them, including I was going to tie in the 1835 convention, but you mentioned that as well. So I don't have to mention that. But I did want to ask, in your research, I know what you did primarily dealt with African-American soldiers or Black patriots. Did you find any, and you mentioned earlier about the mixed race, many were poor, young, and of mixed race, but did you find any other ethnicities that were represented in the Revolutionary War era?
Yeah, as far as Native Americans, it's, I'd say the literature on specifically Catawba soldiers, there's some sources that exist on them, but I wasn't able to really hone in on specific individuals of maybe Native American exclusive ancestry in my research. But we know that there were different groups, descendants of the eastern tribal groups in the eastern part of North Carolina, and people from kind of that southern Virginia area who migrated into North Carolina, and who married and had children with African Americans or with often poor white farmers living in that area also. So I wasn't able to really differentiate that, but a lot of people in that area had a mixed race background that it would take a little bit of genealogical research to comb through, but I would be interested in looking at that.
Well, thank you for your presentation. And now we're going to switch over and talk to Mr. John Rees. He's the author of the book, They Were Good Soldiers, African-American Serving in the Continental Army, 1775 to 1783. And we could probably bring you on just to talk about your experiences in doing period reenactments.
I've never gotten frostbite doing that, but some of the people actually did frostbite. Yeah.
Well, and so you concentrated more on the Continental Army more than the militiamen. So
yes.
Okay. So the floor is yours, and we want to give it to you. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
And we'll take questions at the end. So go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll fill them at the end.
Okay. And how would I switch switch screen my slides?
Just say next.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. In my rather brief presentation, I hope to cover a lot of ground. I'll begin with a short discussion of segregated regiments, and then turn to an overview of African Americans in the Continental Army. Then take a look at overall numbers with some comparison of state numbers. Along the way, we'll take a look at how the Continental Army treated men of color and shared the stories of several individual North Carolina soldiers. And if we have time, I'll close with a discussion of women of color with the Army. Before I go into the main portion of my talk, I want to note that with one exception, throughout the war, states' continental regiments were integrated organizations. The exception to that rule, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment, was one of 3 regiments 1 Continental, 1 Loyalist, 1 French, that were staffed with white officers and non-commissioned officers, and with private soldiers consisting solely of men of color. Next. Next slide, please. The greatest, or the earliest, was the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment, formed by Royal Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, in 1775. It was manned with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia. That unit was disbanded after 1 year. 6 months later, in March 1777, British Commander-in-Chief Sir William Howe barred black men from serving in Loyalist units, directing that all Negroes, mulattoes, and other improper persons who have been admitted into the Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. For 3 to 4 years after that order, armed blacks were not allowed to serve in Crown-established Loyalist regiments. Next slide. In March 1779, the French military formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue, formed in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment was formed of both free and enslaved black men. The latter were promised their freedom in return for military service. Their first action was at the siege of British-held Savannah, Georgia, in autumn 1779, and the unit went on to serve in the Caribbean and was disbanded in 1783. Next, please. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment and its precursors began as integrated units. With manpower shortfalls early in 1778, the Rhode Island legislature decided to recruit black and Indian slaves who would be freed upon enlistment. The so-called Black Regiment existed only from March 1778 to June 1780, serving the whole time with the exception of 1 company in Rhode Island. A single company was formed of veteran soldiers of color in May 1778 at Valley Forge. That company participated in the June Monmouth campaign and battle. In January 1781, the remaining 2 companies were combined with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment to form a single Rhode Island Regiment. That unit has 7 white companies and 2 black companies. The last 2 companies, 1 white, 1 integrated, of that regiment were finally discharged in December 1783. So now back to the rest of the Continental Army. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were made public in 1776, Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans had been fighting for 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army, Navy, and States Militia. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. Black soldiers' motivation for joining the Continental Army and their treatment while serving are important to any discussion of the military experience. The reasons largely mirrored those of their fellow white and Indian soldiers. Many fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in the new country. Some, perhaps many, joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected to the prospect of serving alongside family or friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. And after the ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence, some fought for their own freedom or for that of their loved ones. Forced service was another factor. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in a Continental Regiment. Whites were also occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return for military service. Most of those promises were honored, but some veterans were kept in bondage. Of course, the major dividing line between white and black common soldiers was the American system that enslaved 90% of the country's African Americans and treated free blacks as second-class citizens. One remarkable result of my research on Black Continental soldiers is finding that they largely received the same considerations as their white comrades. At the most basic level, soldiers of color, both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. As regards all those things, both whites and soldiers of color suffered together in times of scarcity and jointly enjoyed the rare times of bounty. The most glaring case of unequal treatment was that black soldiers were largely barred from serving in any rank other than drummer, fifer, or private soldier. And further, in the early war years, they were occasionally given labor details more often than white soldiers, but that ended by the conflict's middle years. In the end, there may have been difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' personal or race animus, but to my knowledge and research, such instances were few and far between. So now for an overview of early service. Next slide, please. Black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militia men of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside their white comrades from Lexington to Concord and back to Boston on April 17, 1775. To date, we have the names of 35 Black men present that day, at least 18 seeing combat. One, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's company on Lexington Green. It's likely that as many as 40 to 50 African Americans were with the militia on the war's first day. 2 months later, at least 88 Black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have served at the Bunker Hill battle. One historian estimates the total may be as high as 150, roughly 5% of the American troops involved. Now, there are several mentions of Black participation in those early actions, but this is my favorite, speaking to the courage and resilience of African-American soldiers and the effect one man's determination had on another. John Greenwood, a white soldier, noted of the day, "Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. As I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill, it was filled with chairs and wagons bearing the wounded and dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and his collar being open, and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers. I saw the wound quite plainly and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt much. He said no, that he was only going to get a bandage put on it and meant to return. You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war." Now, despite their proven ability, African Americans were early on deemed unfit for continental service. The May 1775 Massachusetts Provincial Revolution stated that no slaves be admitted into this army upon any consideration whatever. By contrast, in October 1775, Council of Officers agreed unanimously to reject all slaves, and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether. On November 12, Army orders directed, "Neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men fit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted." Signaling a change of policy, at the end of December, General George Washington told of numbers of free Negroes who are desirous of enlisting, giving leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. And as a side note, African Americans were never evicted from the Army and continued to serve during the 8-month paper exercise of deciding if they should be soldiers or not. Now, given the desperate need to fill continental regiments, Washington's decree was generally adopted, and the American Army remained a racially integrated organization to the war's end. And Black musket-bearing soldiers, Continentals, and militia fought in every major battle of the war, and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. And I will repeat that. Black musket-bearing soldiers, Continentals, and militia fought in every major battle of the war, and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. A number of Americans noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably with the claim they were unsuited to be soldiers, but positive remarks were in the majority. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about Black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, Adams called them unsuitable for service. General John Thomas replied, "In the New England regiments at Roxbury, Massachusetts, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men for fatigue and inaction. Many of them have proved themselves brave." Europeans were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, "The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence, you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them." And Baron Ludwig von Closen, aide-de-camp to French General Rochambeau, wrote in July 1781, "I had a chance to see the American Army man for man. It is really painful to see those brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that the soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and Blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly." As for numbers, Closen claimed, a quarter of Washington's army were Negroes, merry, confident, and sturdy. Regarding Closen's estimate of numbers, my research indicates that while the proportion of Black Continentals likely increased in the later war years, in 1781, they were more likely about 8 to 10% of the army. Next slide, please. At the onset of the, now we're going to head into some numbers, which are important. At the onset of the War for American Independence, approximately 500,000 African Americans lived in the colonies, of whom some 450,000 were enslaved. Blacks fought in provincial regiments prior to the war, and roughly 5,000 African-American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, in service of the revolutionary cause. While accurate numbers are hard to come by, the American population at the time was approximately some 2.1 million. Free Blacks comprised 2.4% of the overall population, and slaves formed 21.5%. In August 1778, a tally was made of the number of Black soldiers in 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. There were 755 African Americans in a force totaling almost 21,000 rank and file, corporals, music, and private soldiers, making them 3.6% of the whole. Now, while that proportion may seem small, by themselves, Black soldiers would form two understrength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most serving Continental regiments. And we also have to recall that free Blacks formed 2.4% of the overall American population. Even considering numbers of slaves who served, free African Americans were well represented as regards military service. Next slide, please. To give some perspective on North Carolina in relation to the whole, here are estimates of the 1780 population taken from my book, They Were Good Soldiers. The August 1778 return revealed 58 North Carolina Black soldiers, or 1.28% of the free Black population. And that's given my numbers, my estimates for 1780. If anybody has better estimates for any of the years in the Revolution, I'd be happy to get them. Some numbers of North Carolina soldiers were enslaved, especially in the later war years. Next slide, please. Here then are the 6 brigades reporting the highest proportion of Black soldiers on August 1778 return. As you can see, 3 are from New England and 3 from the southern states. North Carolina ranks 4th. By comparison, the middle states of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, not shown here, of course, had very few Black soldiers. And as you can see, these brigades percentages are all higher than the 15 brigade proportion of 3.63%. Parsons, Connecticut brigade is the highest at 9.31. North Carolina brigade had 4.81. Next slide, please. And using those numbers, we can calculate the average number of Black soldiers per regiment within each brigade. With this criteria, North Carolina moved up to 2nd. The highest, of course, was Connecticut, again, Parsons, with 37 Black soldiers per regiment. Each regiment had about 8 or 9 companies at that time. Most had 8 companies. So those Black soldiers would have been either spread through the companies or they may have been grouped in one company. We really don't know. And North Carolina had 29 Black soldiers per regiment. Next slide, please. So here we have a modern image of a single company of Henley's additional regiment in 1779. It's a good representation. Oh, I'm sorry. So did you skip a slide, or did I? Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I forgot about this. Let's go back to the slide you just had on. There we go. This I wanted to put this on here because it actually shows for the Rhode Island Regiment, the proportion of Black and Indian soldiers were actually much larger than even any brigade in that 1778 return. You can see even in 1777, both regiments together, soldiers of color amounted to 17.5% of rank and file strength. And beginning in 1778, you had the regiment that was composed of Black and Indian private soldiers. That continued all the way to 1781 when the remaining 2 companies were combined with the 1st Rhode Island to form a single Rhode Island regiment. At that time, soldiers of color comprised 29% of the regiment, far higher than any proportion on the 1778 return. Next, please. Okay, now we'll go back. Here we have a modern image of a single company of Henley's additional regiment in 1779. It's a good representation of how many Continental companies would have appeared, with some having a few more Black soldiers and others none at all. To reiterate, the proportion of African-American soldiers may be considered rather small, but that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued into the late 19th century. And more importantly, foreign observers and others likely considered African-Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement, almost on a par with the Declaration of Independence and taking up arms against the King's Army. It may have been an unintentional and to some unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and just as pragmatic arming of Blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. So before we look at individual soldiers, an overview of North Carolina Continental regiments during the war or may be useful. At its greatest, North Carolina's contribution to the Continental Army consisted of 10 foot regiments, all under strength during most of their service. By 1778, the units were so reduced that the remaining men were concentrated in the 1st and 2nd North Carolina, while officers were sent home to recruit and form 4 new regiments with mixed success. One unit, the 3rd North Carolina, filled with 9-month levies from the militia, was sent north to work on the West Point fortifications and mustered out in spring 1779. Following the May 1780 loss of Charleston, South Carolina, including North Carolina's 3 remaining Continental regiments, the state struggled to raise new regiments to replace their loss. In April 1781, Major Pinkerton Eaton led an ad hoc North Carolina Continental unit of 170 drafted men enlisted for 12 months. He joined General Greene's forces in South Carolina. By mid-June 1781, Brigadier General Jethro Sumner had organized 1 North Carolina regiment with volunteers and drafts, with a 2nd regiment in progress but still informed. And Sumner's men, only 200 of his 500 troops were armed. He said that his troops consisted of delinquents and old Continental soldiers. Sumner sent that regiment to join Greene's force. And by early August, General Sumner, with the 2nd regiment, joined General Greene, and Lieutenant Colonel John Armstrong was given command of that. Both regiments, possibly combined into one unit, participated in the Eutaw Springs action on September 8, 1781. The day before that battle, a small force of North Carolina Continentals under Major Redding Blunt had joined the Army. A leavening of experienced men was added to Blunt's levies and formed into a 3rd regiment. In spring 1782, expiring enlistments and scant numbers of new enlistees led to a reduction of the North Carolina line to 2 regiments, and then in winter 1783 to a single regiment, soon to be disbanded. Next slide, please. Now for the soldier stories. These come from veterans' 19th century pension narratives, which historian John C. Dan called one of the largest oral history projects ever undertaken. William Stewart served through the 1778 Philadelphia and Monmouth campaigns and returned south in late 1779. His pension deposition reads as follows. He was born in Brunswick County, state of Virginia, removed to North Carolina, Northampton County, re-enlisted in the year 1777 under Major Hardy Murphy, a Continental recruiting officer. He was then marched to Halifax, North Carolina, and from that to Alexandria in Virginia, where they were assembled. There were assembled 1,500 new recruits, where those who had not had the smallpox were inoculated. In the last of this September of the same year, we were marched to a place, he actually calls it White Marsh, it was actually Wilmington, Delaware. And there joined the headquarters of General Washington, where the detachment was placed in the company of Captain Fenner in the 2nd Regiment of the North Carolina Line. We there wintered and in spring marched to Valley Forge on Schuylkill River, and from thence to West Point on North River, and was there at the time the British took Stony Point. He was marched among other places to the White Plains, Paramus, Hackensack, and Long Island, and was in the Battle of Monmouth under the command of James Hogan. We marched to various places in Jersey, and finally marched through Baltimore to North Carolina, and was discharged in the month of June in the year 1780. His discharge was signed by General Hogan, having served 3 years, the full term of his enlistment. He preserved his discharge for many years until it was worn out and lost. After his discharge, he remained in Northampton County, North Carolina, until about 27 years ago, when he removed with his family into Pennsylvania and has for the last 21 years resided in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. He is a colored man, but was freeborn. So we can see the breadth of his experience from his pension, but we can also see how far afield he got. Most 18th century Americans prior to the Revolution probably would not have traveled very far from their home place. And in this case he got all the way up to New York and back to North Carolina. Next slide, please. Willis Boone began his wartime career as an infantry soldier, switching to a light dragoon cavalry regiment after his discharge. And in his pension, he wrote, or he testified, 11th day of October, 1820. Willis Boone, aged 70 years, doth on his oath make the following declaration, that he enlisted for the terms of 2 years and a half in the year 1776 in the state of North Carolina, in the company commanded by Captain John Pugh Williams in the regiment commanded by Colonel Buncombe. He continued to serve in the said corps until after the Battle of Germantown, when his regiment was reduced and was transferred to the regiment commanded by Colonel Polk, in which he served out the balance of his 2.5 years. He then served in the regiment commanded by Colonel Murphy for 1 year, and at the expiration of that time, enlisted in the Corps of Light Horse commanded by Colonel William Washington, in which he continued until the end of the war. And the image, of course, shows Washington's cavalry at the Battle of Cowpens. He was in the battles of Brandywine, Germantown, Camden, and Guilford Courthouse, and has no other evidence now in his power of his said services except the next certificate from Colonel Nicholas Long. And Long was former deputy quartermaster of the Southern Department during the war. Mr. Boone then recounted his situation in 1820. Willis Boone maketh oath that he has no real property. His personal property consists of 1 cow and calf, some small articles of household furniture not worth $20, a little corn and fodder, the remains of his last year's crop, not worth $5. He labors for support in the cultivation of the earth, being permitted to occupy a small field of ground free of rent. He has no person residing with him but his wife, an old woman, and she is the only person from whose labor he derives any assistance. Next slide, please. So post-war, many Black veterans fell in hard times, but some more so than others. Several Virginia veterans told of enslaved family members when they applied for pensions in the early 19th century. John Pebbles, though a free man, testified, by occupation, I am a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I'm not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 50 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, named aged 11 years. Thomas Mahorny was a planter on a little farm, not his, and is rendered unable to pursue it by reason of his age and infirmity. His family residing with him are as follows: his wife Mima and his son Jack, both of which are slaves. He being a free man of color who served in the War of the Revolution and is unassisted by the labor of his family. Drury Scott, a veteran of the 10th Virginia Regiment, noted, my occupation is that of a rough carpenter, but I can get but little work, and if I had more, I could not do it. My wife is all my family, but being a slave can render me no assistance. Next slide, please. I now want to speak to the African-American women who, by their own free will or the will of others, served with the Army. And to correct the popular view of Army women, Black and white, they were by and large respectable and respected. Any women who were not long tolerated in the Army. Now, unfortunately, to date, I've not discovered any North Carolinian women who followed Continental regiments. I'm still looking, and if anybody has information, please let me know. But among those, the number of Black women with the Army I've discovered, some of them were servants. One of them was Hannah Till, who served in General Washington's military household and gave birth to a son at Valley Forge. Another was Sarah, a slave who emancipated herself and her son and joined the 1st Maryland Regiment for several months in 1778. But I want to focus on one woman, Judith Lines, and read a portion of a letter written to her by a husband. In fact, the only known such letter written by an African-American home. And the letter was published for the first time in They Were Good Soldiers. To preface the Lines letter, John Lines enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point and other Hudson Highland posts. By Judith Lines' own testimony, they were married in July 1781. She recalled, the next summer after I married, 1782, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands, that's in New York. At that time, my husband was a waiter for Colonel Sherman, and while at the camps, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months. Mrs. Lyons noted in a pension application, "My husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, and which I give to the magistrate who takes this my deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband." And now the letter. I take this opportunity to send to you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Sherman's regiment, Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter how you have lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed that cow, or whether you've got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see you myself, then I could talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death. John Lyons. Now, this is a rather simple letter, and it's also abbreviated. There's quite a bit more, but it shows how much he misses his home and his family, and it also shows that the fact that Judith Lyons was home taking care of the farm and also at least 2 or 3 children on her own, possibly with the help of family or neighbors. And we also find out from Judith's testimony that she had smallpox, which is a pretty horrific disease. And she may have come through that. With scars on her face, since smallpox could badly scar the one who suffers from it. Next slide, please. John and Judith Lyons and other veterans returned home to a changed and changing nation. Despite the waning of Northern slavery and the ratification of the 1789 United States Constitution and boosted by the 1794 Cotton Gin Patent, Black bondage was cemented as a political and economic fact, and detrimental racial attitudes hardened before, but more especially after 1800. 35 years after the war, Black Revolutionary veterans, along with their white comrades, were eligible for service pensions. But even in that system, some experienced the effect of increasing bias. When all is said and done, African-American military service was a direct challenge to slavery and the racial construct, and an affront to many white citizens. Still, Black Americans continued to fight for their nation, as 81-year-old Judith Lyons related in 1837. She testified, "My youngest son died of a wound received in the last war, the War of 1812. His name was Benjamin, the wound received at the Battle of Chippewa, July 5, 1814. And Black Revolutionary veterans remain proud of their service, as attested by Trevor Freeman, who in his pension application valued all his belongings at $15.75. At the end of the list, he added one more item: Revolutionary uniform, invaluable. And in closing, former Private Henry Hallowell, a white 5th Massachusetts Regiment veteran, gave this simple but fitting tribute to the African-American soldiers, free and slave, who served the revolutionary cause in a number of roles. Quote, "In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Pomp Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers." And if you turn to the next slide, please. And there are some excellent sources to look at more into North Carolina soldiers of the war, and also Quarles's book. It's an older book, but it's a great overview of the war with a lot of details in it too. And I think it's the 4th one is an online collection of articles that I have available, which discusses African Americans in the British Army, in Hessian regiments. I think there's an article on the Black Dragoons in South Carolina in 1782. So there's a number of articles there that you may be interested in. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rees, John Rees, and also thank you to Trevor Freeman. And appreciate you giving us that wonderful information. I'm sure we learned a lot. And I'm going to quickly go and field some questions that I saw in the chat. And I believe the first one, I'm going to go to you, Mr. Freeman. It was, I believe it was right after you spoke. So I'm assuming that the viewer was asking based on your presentation. But the question is, Did you mention someone named Hicks? I believe you did. Okay.
Yeah.
And so there's currently a number of people named Hicks in and around Orange County, North Carolina. And we wonder if there's a possibility of some relation with that name.
Yeah. I can't say for certain, but I think that's certainly a possibility. And that's something I've been interested in, since I put this out, was to maybe see, which families still have living descendants in North Carolina. I know, particularly the Chavis family, who became probably the wealthiest free Black families in North Carolina in this time period. They lived in, I think, the kind of Granville, Halifax region, and they still have, there's still Chavises living in that part of the state who are related to them. So, and with what you mentioned earlier about Ishmael Titus's family still living, did you say Massachusetts now, or?
They're in New York.
New York. Okay, yeah, because he originally settled in Massachusetts. That's where he filed his pension from. So it's super interesting to see, the ongoing family remembrances of some of these veterans.
Okay, and quickly, as we're getting to our close here, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. I know Joni has a question that I'm gonna ask her to raise in a second, and Joanna or Bianca, if you have one, or even Sarah. But John, I got this question from earlier. This is for John Rees. Was there a general consensus on the African or Black soldiers in the Continental Army as far as their performance? Was it seen as favorable or unfavorable? Does your research answer that?
Yeah, it was seen as more than favorable. Like I said, early in the war, there were a number of detractors. Some basically just didn't like the look of the regiments with Black soldiers in them. They weren't used to it. Some of those guys actually came around. Some of them were Pennsylvanians and actually joined the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1785 when it was reconstituted. And I think the wartime experiences actually with African American soldiers actually affected their attitude towards African American citizens, because a number of, especially Pennsylvania officers, joined the Pennsylvania Abolition Society right after the war. So it's and some of them actually went on to really vehemently fight the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Some of them even said that if slavery was propagated, then their service in the war would have been the blackest time of their life, because it would have been all for naught.
Okay.
So yes, it really did affect attitudes. It really did.
Okay. One of Ishmael Titus descendants. Okay, and one of Ishmael Titus descendants says Chioma. She lives here in Greensboro. And I'm gonna, Joanna, if you have a question, go ahead in. Joni had a question, but her laptop went out, but I see that she's coming back in. Joni, if you're able, you can ask your question, or I can ask it for you. It's up to you. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, I'll ask it. Now, her question was to both either you, Trevor Freeman, or John Rees. With the extensive research that you did, and you did a lot, it's obvious to us now, and you had to take some deep dives. So we're wondering how this impacted you personally. How did it impact did it change your viewpoint about history? Did it change your viewpoint of the subjects that you were studying? But how did this affect your life?
Trevor, you want to go?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say when I started my research for my thesis, the thing that originally sparked my interest was during the first really controversial days of the Kaepernick kneeling situation, where there's so much backlash, and it just sparked my interest in African American service, in this foundational war, and this moment in American history that's so wrapped up in a lot of mystique, and just trying to see what motivated African Americans to serve for the American forces, when the offer of British freedom in many cases was so much more visceral and easily apparent. It just, it made me realize that, there's this history of African American service and just a critical part of even the foundational story of American history that's really not documented as well, and certainly not commemorated as well. Haven't watched any of the monument talks, and I'm sure you've probably addressed, like the national monument to Revolutionary War African American soldiers and how that's still stalled out, still hasn't been erected. It makes me realize there's still so much work to be done, not only in research, but also in commemoration and acknowledging this.
Well, I'd like to say that one thing that, I went into this with an open mind. I basically just wanted to find out what their service was, and I was really interested in numbers. But one of the things that I was interested to look into to see if I could find out was their treatment in service. And as I said in my talk, I found very, very little evidence of poor treatment in service. They were, by and large, treated the same as the white soldiers. Now, this is probably not to say much, because Continental soldiers as a whole were basically treated pretty badly. But still, there was the same pay, same. In the 1860 Civil War, there was a huge to do about the fact that United States colored troops were paid less than the white soldiers. That didn't happen during the Revolution. Also, the war in Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey, and probably to a certain extent in Massachusetts, maybe even Connecticut, was a really radical revolution where they, just before the Constitutional Convention, there was an effort to get depositions from people in around the Philadelphia or southeastern New Jersey and southern New Jersey and southeastern Pennsylvania. And those depositions were basically white people saying how much they valued their Black neighbors. And they wanted to submit this to the Constitutional Convention, and were basically, in the end, were talked out of doing so because they were told that it would basically make the Southerners not want to really compromise. But those depositions actually all still exist, and there's quite a number of them. I'm just happy to see that there is more being written. Trevor did a great, as his dissertation or thesis is a great piece, and there's more and more being written about them, about African American soldiers. And in my book, I include a small appendix on African American women. And I'm still doing research. I'm still doing research on African Americans and Indians in the Army. I hope to get to do another second book on the subject. I'm just really happy that I decided to do this as my first book. I really am.
I was muted. I said we're happy that you did that as well, and remind folks they can go on to Amazon to get your book. They Were Good Soldiers. African American soldiers in the Continental Army, 1777 to 1783.
75 to 83, yeah. So
75 to 1783.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. And last question I'm going to take because of time. Do either of you have ancestors who served in the American Revolutionary War?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. As far as I could tell, no one enlisted. I think they were either aged out or too young.
I didn't know that I had ancestors for a long time. I've been writing for 30 years, and people would say, do you write because you had ancestors and fought in the war? And I would say no. The only one that I knew of was a Quaker that lived in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and never served. Probably paid the militia fines. But then my cousin found out that we had a number of ancestors who served out of Philadelphia, who served in the American or the Philadelphia militia. Then they're called the Associators, and actually a number of them fought at the Battle of Princeton, which really surprised me. And again, it's not the reason I did it. It wasn't a personal reason why I did do this research. But it was a nice to know that that they went before me and they they contributed to the cause.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I think this was a good bookend for the series, Minding Our Monuments, Discovering Lost Pieces of Greensboro History in Public Spaces. And again, I want to thank you all, Trevor Freeman with the Western North Carolina Historical Association and John Rees. And please check out his book, They Were Good Soldiers. And to our volunteers and my staff here at the Greensboro History Museum, but particularly to these volunteers that helped put this series together. It was Joanna Foley, who's off mic, lives in California, who inspired this, but because of her history. She has an ancestor who owned enslaved folks and has a city named after her in North Carolina, and a monument in the National Courthouse, the Guilford County National Courthouse. So, and Bianca Cobb, who's a history lover, and our intern, Joni McMasters. But I think the fact that we had you two closing it out illustrated or made a point for us, and I think being a history lover myself, working at a history museum, you validate one's experience or their ancestors' experience when you have others that desire to know about it. And too often it's folks that look like each other wanting to know about their own history. So when we have Trevor Freeman, a white male, and John Rees, a white male, talking about African Americans fighting in the Revolutionary War, you make that inclusive, you make that an American experience. And so I think that's a good way to close this out, and a good way to address the disparities that we brought up in the series and we alluded to tonight. So thank you for joining us and closing this thing out the right way.
Thank you. Thank you so much.